Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
If our job as game developers is to create these worlds of enchantment and to help us notice when moments of phenomenon are happening, we're also at a time where technology is taking off in an unprecedented way that will take things that before we had to imagine and felt like enchantment and make them actually real.
My name is Chris Skaggs, and I will be your podcast host today. This episode is an interview with Amy and Ryan Green, which was recorded in January of 2025. Here, veteran game developers and designers with a very keen eye for technology and the artistic bent discuss how gaming has evolved in the last many years, how AI and other technologies are affecting the process, and what we might do by ways of being productive and lights to our industry. I hope you enjoy what you hear. As a quick point of history, Ryan and I met many years ago when Amy first kind of was rolling through town and offered to introduce us as a birthday present. So at the time, Ryan had a different software job, kind of wanted to work in games. I had just recently started a game company. She's like, hey, when you guys meet, it'll be fun for his birthday. And I thought that was pretty weird, but Amy's just forward like that. So in the end, that's where we met. That was, I want to say this probably 2005 or 6, maybe not quite that long, but it was a while back. And ever since then, I think we've been on this strange and wild path of where the video game industry is going. And I think more and more we've been making colleagues and allies like AI and Faith on this strange journey. So Amy and Ryan, thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts. Probably the easiest thing is, like, for folks who don't know you, could you tell a little bit about your story, about how you got here and what brings you especially to where you are now?
So yeah, Ryan and I have been making video games together and separately over the last few years. The game that we made that brought us the most attention and gave us the most opportunities long term was actually a game that was known for telling a really vulnerable story in a medium that isn't especially known for vulnerability. And that was a video game we created about our young son's battle with a brain tumor. After our son was 2 years old at the time, he'd been diagnosed with cancer, but it was really at the point where they told us that his cancer had returned and that his cancer was terminal, that we started to really think in earnest about how we could express what it was that we were feeling. You know, the whole time, anytime your life changes in a really fundamental way, if you're a person who leans toward kind of artistic expression, you're thinking about, how do I express how this feels? This isn't how my life felt before. It's not how the lives of my friends and my family feel. How do I express what this is like? But for us, especially once they told us that his cancer was terminal, we started thinking about our life and our story in a different way. And we started thinking about how we could describe this moment of what it was like kind of to live in the shadow of death with our son. And we made, I guess, the unconventional choice to express those things through a video game. But the reason I think that it made sense was just through an understanding of the medium, that video games are all about agency. They're all about winning. They're usually kind of these power fantasies. And so when we went to tell a story about having no agency, about not winning, about the desperation you feel when you have a lack of power over your circumstances, it really actually was a really perfect medium for telling that story, because you subvert the expectations of the medium, and then that causes the people experiencing it through that medium to identify with some of those same feelings because they have certain expectations that are being thwarted. So creating that video game, That Dragon Cancer, really allowed Ryan and I to work together and for us to start to make other games. And we've gone on to make other things since then that I'll let Ryan chat about.
Before I talk about that, I just wanted to set the context for our choices. You know, as artists, I think that grew up in an evangelical tradition and a charismatic tradition, for us, art was both a tool for teaching as well as an expression of faith. And I think that where we started in our journey was that this creative process was not only an act of vulnerability, but it was also an act of faith. That we were doing this in order to be a testimony or to be a tool, right, in the broader story. I think an important context, because I think it kind of explains the decision making of like being able to just like open ourselves up like that, and almost like the impetus, like the just like a reason to do it. And I think what we learned in the journey was that this process of being vulnerable means that we couldn't totally control our narrative either. Like our hope was for a testimony of a miracle. And what happened was that Joel passed away 4 years later after he was first diagnosed. And so the journey for us has been this process of going from having answers to having questions. And as we kind of face this new era of so much uncertainty and so much change, I think it changed our posture as artists and changed our posture towards technology, and it changed our posture towards faith and everything else.
That's really good. Something occurs to me that most of the time, and Dragon Cancer was, I want to say, 10 years old now, or I'm trying, like, when was that published? Is that right?
2016. Yeah.
Okay. So just about 10 years old. And your lives, of course, are so much more than that one story. Like, that's a huge story. It's a powerful one. But I'm aware of the way, and this is part of just how things go, is that this becomes, I think, often the things people want you to talk about. But what else do you want to talk about? Like, what else, especially Ryan, I know how artistic you are, how expressive you are. Like, and Amy, like, you and I have had a chance to do some other stories, but what else is out there? I don't want you to get pigeonholed like Spock or something. Like, this is the thing you do. We talked about the dragon story. Like, what else is out there?
I love technology. I'm a techno optimist in many ways. I'm always interested in what's new and what's emerging. I'm also interested in kind of like the metaphysical implications of all of these things. I think the thing that most interests me lately is how it kind of started with, after that Dragon Cancer, we were asked by a large pharmaceutical company to do some work in sharing other people's story of cancer, and then eventually like creating games that are accessible for kids with spinal muscular atrophy, which is a degenerative disease that results in motor neuron death. So children with this disease go from being functioning to not being able to like move most of their body parts and being able to have like articulate their finger, right? And what's been amazing is that the new therapies that have come out have are really miraculous. They really stop the march of that disease. But what it exposed me to was like this world of accessibility, and how accessibility and disability is more of a function of the architecture of our world, right? Like the way that our technology and our decisions allow or prevent certain people from participating. And I think that became acute during COVID. And I think, in this process of designing for and thinking about expressiveness, thinking about technology, we often see technology as like a replacement. But I question if technology is maybe just augmentation. It's a way of extending ourselves. And I think that has metaphysical implications. I think that causes us to question like our definitions. And so I'm most interested in that space, in the collision of technology, what it means to be human, and how do we express that creatively.
What about you, Amy?
Of course, I'm fascinated with story. I'm fascinated with new and innovative ways to approach story. I'm always especially interested in this movement we've seen in immersive theater that is not taking place in a traditional like theater with a stage and seats, where the audience is part of the experience, either wittingly or unwittingly, where it's happening in unconventional spaces, where it's happening with a touch of improvisation. And that feels like a really prime space for video games to come and meet storytelling in a really unique space, because video games have mastered this art of interactivity. So how to let the player be a part of the story and enforce their will on a story, successfully or unsuccessfully, right? But it's all about what are their choices and how will their choices impact the story. So when you get into the space of immersive theater, you're talking about how do we involve the audience in a new way. And so that usually gets my brain really, really going in some fascinating ways, because games and video games don't have to happen only in digital spaces. And theater and performance art doesn't have to happen in traditional stage spaces. And so if we can blend and mix mediums, I think we'll actually see a lot more of the blending and mixing of mediums in the next decade or two, that will stop narrowly defining every medium as like so separate. We'll start to blend them and use each medium for what it does well. And then that, of course, brings us around to the conversation of AI and how Will AI storytelling change the stories we make? What parts of the storytelling will it take on for us? How will it change how we tell a story? As a writer, I'm thinking all the time about how the nature of storytelling will change if I'm not writing every piece of dialogue, but instead I'm writing characters. I'm writing a full backstory for a character. They grew up impoverished, so they worry about these things still. They have this hang up, they're triggered by this, they're questioning this thing, they have this motivation, and then I make 30 characters like that and set them into motion in a way where we watch the story unfold and we direct the action through the creation of personality rather than through like dictating every line of dialogue. I think there's some fascinating things that are about to start happening with storytelling, and I'm excited to see the first very feeble approaches to them, and then I suspect within my lifetime I'll see that really mastered in a unique way.
I think going back to that question of context, like if we were coming from this perspective of like controlling the story in order to teach you something versus coming into a story with a question or with a thought and then having to be in the posture of curiosity with your audience. Like if you have to care who your audience is, and you have to care what they're bringing into the story, like what their traumas are, what their histories are. It's not only about communicating a message. I think our storytelling might evolve into seeking understanding. I think that creates like a powerful prospect for it being a unifying agent in our culture.
We've had this conversation before, and I think largely suggested that Roger Ebert made this statement that a video game can't be a piece of art until it makes me cry. And I think that for lots of people, that Dragon Cancer was maybe their first experience and maybe their only experience in which that case. That largely it was about emotions and vulnerability. There was a depth to it. Let's talk a little bit about where you see from the artistic sense, where do games fit in the artistic landscape for the next generation? I'll also point, you do something, Ryan, I'd like you to speak to, and that's your generative art. I'd like to make sure that you chat on that.
I mean, I think it's interesting that we talk about the next generation and how video games will fit into like an artistic expression for them. You know, I just joined consultancy recently making some games on Roblox, and they're hiring these Roblox game developers who are young people, you know, 20, 21, 22, who are coming and starting to make games with us and saying, oh yeah, I've been making games on Roblox since I was 12. So they're entering the workforce at the age of 22 with 10 years of experience building games on a platform that they love. And so they've grown up telling stories in games on whatever level. Now, not all of them are focused and fascinated on telling stories through games. Some of them just want to build interesting mechanics. Some of them love the social aspect, right? Everyone's focused on a different thing. But the storytellers who want to tell stories in games have grown up doing it. Ryan and I wanted to tell a story in a game, and you could tell from the international press it received, it was shocking to people that you would use this medium to try to convey a story. But if you grew up from the age of 10 or 11 on, creating games like we maybe, you know, scribbled down little stories in notebooks, I think about the depth they're going to be able to bring to creation within this medium. It's going to be very different because we grew up writing down stories in a notebook and they grew up building Roblox games. Their mediums will shift over time. I suspect they won't all stay building for Roblox, although some of them may, but some of them may move on to VR, some of them may move on to XR, some of them may move on to new technologies. I know Ryan is the type of person, and he's going to talk about his generative art, where what fascinates him is not necessarily telling stories in any one medium, but telling stories in the newest medium, because every medium changes the nature of how we express ourselves. But as humans, we can't help but express ourselves. And so trying to solve the problem of how do we use this brand new technology to tell a different kind of story? What does this medium excel at? What does this medium do that other mediums can't do? And that's kind of his jam. And I suspect the younger generation will do that too, and just adopt the newest technology for storytelling.
I think games are a prototype of future realities. I see digital landscape as kind of dreams becoming lucid, in the way that when we think about like the worlds that live within our brains and the things that we imagine and dream, the ways that reality breaks in our brains, that it's transformed. You know, if you've ever flown in a dream, if you ever had new superpowers, digital worlds, when they augment us, when they interrupt our senses, they give us new senses and new sensibilities. And I think that this generation is the first to kind of grow up digitally native, and we take for granted how much like our phones have augmented us, how they've given us new senses. Like my watch on my hand taps me when I get a text message. That's a new sense and it's connected to everybody else in the world. Anybody can talk to me by tapping my wrist. I take video games very seriously in that as technology like rapidly evolves, we've started to see like AIs start to dream different realities. There are these videos out on the internet of like AIs dreaming video games and then having you be able to control these new imagined worlds in real time. And so I think we have to think about like how that will change us when we are not constrained by the architecture of the physical realm, and that we still receive these new inputs and we adapt to them. I think that very real things, like Amy has said before, like maybe it's not real, but very real things happen to people in these places. And I think that what I've seen the first fruits of is these online communities in which people are meeting their partners, where they're getting married, where they're spending a lot of their social time, where they're performing their job. And it all seems rather quaint right now. But I think as like technology starts to take off, I think you'll see people spending a lot more time in these spaces, and they'll be very real to these people, and they form very real relationships. And they're going to form very real relationships with things that may not be people. And I think that we're seeing that with the popularity of the AI companions, right? There's going to be a lot of discomfort and a lot of like adaptation that happens as these mediums allow us to do new things. And I don't think we can anticipate how much they'll change us. Marshall McLuhan talks about the medium as the message and how every new way that these mediums allow us to do something changes us, but we can't anticipate it until it does. And so I think that we're in for this journey of meaning making. And that's why I love this group, is because like you have academics and theologians and engineers and artists all coming together and kind of sort out the ethics of this new world. And so anyway, that's where I think we're going. And I think games are just like a fun like first step in that journey.
I know obviously like the three of us live in the world of games. We talk about games to game people and about game stuff to game players. All that's part of our game world. In this particular context, I want to shift more to the question of the faith side of the puzzle. And there's an observation that some people have made that I'd like to bring to this conversation here. And there's some suspicion that, among some other things, there's some two big movements happening in the body of Christ that I think play into what we're describing. One is the idea of reenchantment and the change from a world that is dominated by the materialist worldview to reawakening the notion that there's something more. And there's a lot of conversation I'm seeing where that seems to be a very human need that may or may not include Christ. It may or may not include the church. It's certainly including lots of other spiritual ancestors, Wicca, shamanism, natures, et cetera, et cetera. But this reenchantment of the world, of course, is something that that Lewis talked about, and Dorothy Sayers, and there were others who were saying that we wind ourselves in a world that needs to be porous. Lewis would talk about one of the functions of Narnia was to say, like, we have to show people that there's more than the five senses can avail. So I want to take about this idea of reenchantment, because I will say, like, I am convinced that is one of the great calls of our field of gaming. Is like we have a remarkable role to tell enchanting stories, winsome stories that actually contextualize and help people explain that. Alongside that trend, people are talking about this move towards discipleship, specifically old world bodily discipleship, like incarnational discipleship. A friend of mine, Lucas Ventura, used to say his favorite part of gaming as an art form was it's embodied to be incarnational. Like you become the thing, not just watch the thing. Like you are the player of agency. So in this context of AI, I'm going to throw one more, the kind of the third horn on the stool. I'd like to conversation there is also an outfit out there who has created an apologetics AI. I want to say it's just called apologetics.ai. And there's a big conversation on whether or not that is a good use of AI. And one of the statements is an LLM by definition is a bullshit generator, that it does not concern itself with truth, it concerns itself with plausibility. And it's really good at making a thing sound plausible, but it doesn't actually know if it's true. And in the world of apologetics, that may be a fundamental flaw. Put these things together, and I'm talking about this, I want to explore, like, where do we see the role of gaming in those trends, if at all? And I'm curious your thoughts.
I can jump in a little bit on the enchantment side, just to say that I do think that games are an interesting way to expand the imagination and to talk about topics in a surprising way, to kind of push a player to imagine worlds beyond our present reality. And I think maybe the more cantankerous our present reality gets, the more we'll want to escape into these worlds where we can imagine a reality that's a little bit different. One of the video games Ryan and I made recently was called Area Man Lives, and it was a virtual reality game. And one of the things we did that was like the really fun creative challenge for us was that we allowed players just to speak naturally to the game, and we used speech detection. And then as a writer, I was writing to not only the responses that I hoped they might say or the things I could predict they might say, but always also anticipating, what if they say nothing? What if they say something I don't expect or don't understand? Like, how do I keep a conversation moving? Which in many ways actually feels a little bit like AI, right? The AI is having to respond in every situation, even when our answers are non sequiturs, or how to keep the conversation moving, even if the logic falls out of places of it, and keep returning back to the conversational path. So in some ways, telling that story was really fascinating. But one of the key points for me in that story, the whole thing, we wove throughout the story the idea of a phenomenon, that something was happening, this moment where people felt seen or felt directed or felt like something pivotal was happening in their life. We didn't give it a religious term. We didn't ever explain it all the way. We would just say, oh, the phenomenon, people keep reporting the phenomenon. And then not only as the player did you encounter these moments of phenomenon in other people's lives, but then it happened to you. So you encounter the phenomenon, and it's in VR. And so we get to do wonderful, fun things you can't do in reality. So suddenly the lights shift and they're kind of this like lovely warm pink, and everything starts floating, and there's like a wild, like deep digital hum like you get in like a fever dream, and like there's just these things happening that kind of can catch your attention and go, oh, like something strange is impacting my reality. Something, we would say, because our game studio is called Numinous Games, we would say something numinous is happening, something beyond my reality that's a little frightening in the way that it's unexpected and not understood. In many ways, that's the fantasy, right? Is that when something matters, somehow everything would change and we'd sense it and we'd feel it and we'd know. But in real life, I think the supernatural and the natural are usually so intertwined that we don't notice. We don't have these beautiful phenomenon moments where everything shifts and we feel it and we know that moment as it's happening. I think that if video games can give us a chance to kind of re-enchant our minds with the idea that there's more happening than maybe we perceive at any given moment, then maybe we start to be a little more attuned to it. We start to watch for it. We start to listen for it. We start to imagine that these things could matter on a realm outside of the realm that we're used to, then maybe we watch for them. I know one of the things I kept thinking about today was it's fascinating to me that in all of our efforts to create AI, and there were all these different approaches and branches and things we were studying, it was when we got to the large language model that things took off. When we started to think of all problems as language problems instead of this is a tech problem and this over here is a math problem and this is a language problem. And there's a biblical text about the Tower of Babel that talks about language being unified. And when language is unified, everything is possible. And then scattering the language is what kind of slowed down the advancement of all like human thought and technology and all of that. So I find it fascinating whether that story is parable, whether that's, whatever that story is, whether it was warning, whether that story was prophecy, like who knows exactly why that particular story was encoded into a holy text of ours. But it has turned out to be somewhat true that as soon as we find a way to actually unify all language and put it all into one model, suddenly things are becoming possible we never dreamed were possible. And so I think that's fascinating, that if our job as game developers is to create these worlds of enchantment and to help us notice when moments of phenomenon are happening, we're also at a time where technology is taking off in an unprecedented way that will take things that before we had to imagine and felt like enchantment and make them actually real. And how we notice those shifts, how we talk about them, the stories we tell about our present reality are going to really dictate what we embrace and what we reject as a society.
Technology allows us to live in the world of what if, right? We can ask what if, and then we can create the world and we can live in it. And we can see the downward effects of it. And I think that these tools can allow us to do that, that can allow us to ask the questions of how then shall we live? Who are we? What are we, and how then shall we live? And I think when you talk about, you mentioned discipleship and you mentioned LLMs being bullshit generators. And I think what's interesting about LLMs being classified that way is that in their most raw state, perhaps they are because all they're doing is understanding the closeness and relations of words to each other, right? They're understanding the relationship, but they don't have meaning. And so then you add the reinforcement learning. And what they're actually doing is they're being taught truth, right? They're being taught by humans like, what is truth? Oh, is this truth? And then it gets ranked. And then that becomes like a probability, right? And the more you train it in a certain way to do certain things, then we call it aligned, right? Now, the thing is that whether it's aligned or not, we don't know. We don't know the consciousness or the reasoning that sits behind all of it, right? But we do get it to behave in a certain way, and we call that truth. And so I think, that's kind of the first step of LLMs. And now in this last year, we've seen like the emergence of reasoning models. And so we have these LLMs that are able to speak and then reinforce themselves in reason, right? And so like what that has done is like, we're taking off on the ability to solve math and solve science problems and solve all of these different things. And so like we see those trends and we're like, well, this will lead us to kind of like this new enlightenment. I think that's really plausible. And so I think the thing that we see now, I think a lot of times we bring our perceptions of intelligence and in our perceptions of who we are and consciousness and all of those things into these, and then we try to train our LLMs to think like us. We make our AI in the image of man. And I think we have to wrestle with that, because I think we're going to have like these really powerful agents that are trained on ideologies. They may not, we call it truth, but what we might be training them in truth is just another icon. It's like another image of what we think is truth. And it might get us closer there, and it might not. And we might have them battle it out on like debates on what truth is. But I think what's most important to me about this, and it especially goes into the discipleship. I've heard people talk about discipleship LLMs and how important it is for them to be able to be trained on truth. And usually what that means is a certain ideological version of a certain sect, of a certain segment of like Christianity, for example. And living in that plurality is really uncomfortable, because like I really like truth. I really like that what's true and what's not. And I think what technology is going to force us to do is be more comfortable in that pluralism and have to wrestle with it, like have to be open to the horizons of what if. And if this is true, then how does that affect how I see reality, how I sort reality? And to me, that can lead to a certain reenchantment. Because when my world personally went from a very small worldview to being able to travel the world and meet lots of people and meet different types of Christians and meet different ideologies and all of those different things, my world got bigger. That increased my awe rather than like diminishing my awe. So I think if we allow these stories that allow us to take different perspectives, ask what if, be challenged by what is truth, I think those things can lead to a reenchantment of the world and something that's like way more complex and magical than we ever could have imagined.
That's really good. I want to kind of add a plug for one of the thoughts that I don't think we had a chance to touch on, and that's this question of essentially embodiment, incarnation, and it's sort of like incarnation with an asterisk, right? So obviously we're talking here about virtual spaces as opposed to material ones. However, Ryan, I think that the work that you've talked about with the accessibility initiative, there's definitely a blurry line here in some cases. When we talk about Elon Musk and Neuralink, like in this case, there's this idea of having technology creating a bridge sometimes between a virtual space and the real space. And I think there's a theology of embodiment that largely has been neglected in the West. It's kind of like starting to reconnect. But I think this is one of the primary differences between gaming as a medium and others, is this question of agency, like as the person doing the thing. And I like to talk about like when I'm Master Chief, I'm chasing the score, right? I take what the game gives me, and these are aliens, and my job is to kill them all. And I'm not thinking about genocide. I'm not thinking about moral issues. I'm thinking about what the game has defined as the rules, and the ability from this case to, one, like as a game designer, to create rules that are maybe not what I expected. And so I think that's one of the things that Dragon Cancer really caught people off guard is, wait a second, I can't do anything. This whole scene, I think about the scene where Joel is in the crib and is dehydrated, and you can't do anything, and that's the game is a utter lack of agency. But I love where this is a place where I think AI, from a plausibility engine perspective, what often hampers game designs is the real limitation. Like, I just cannot write every possible conversation. I can't account for every possible action. But what I could do is that AI could provide that fill-in for a storyteller, for a game designer, to let someone experience a world that had a lot more opportunities. And in so doing, they get to walk in another person's shoes, so to speak. So let's talk a little bit about how that generates empathy, or maybe I don't want to go there, but like, talk about this question of agency and embodiment, please.
I think agency embodiment in video games allow me to care about the person that's playing, like care about the person that I've invited into my world, right? And it has been interesting to me how quickly we kind of ran smack into like the fact that I could hurt somebody by inviting them to play this game in which it was a very real experience I had of Joel being dehydrated, and I was trapped in the hospital and I couldn't comfort him, and nothing I could do could comfort him, and how like at the end of myself is, and then I am. And then I say, hey, video game player, why don't you come in and experience that with me? And I'm going to like shut down all the doors. I'm going to lock everything down and force you into this position of helplessness. And in order for you to do that, you have to be willing to walk into it and stay there. And it was amazing to me when you could hear people recounting playing the scene and talking about holding Joel and seeing him vomit or hearing him cry. And I'm like, we didn't have Joel in the scene. It was just my avatar and the sound of a child crying and my internal monologue, right? But what they remembered was holding Joel and trying to comfort him. And what that does is that triggered something very familiar in them and common to us that was like a very real trauma response. And I remember the first time that I had somebody play that game, they got like like 30 seconds in. We were in a bar of all places. Got like 30 seconds in. The man got up, took off his headphones, turned around and just like embraced me and started to weep and say, I'm so sorry. That was when I realized, like, I'm holding people's hearts in my hand. I am bringing them in and I'm saying, have a trauma response with me. It's okay. It will be safe, right? And I think that that's the power of what we have in these spaces. And I don't think that we should discount that power. I think we have to be very careful with it. And so when we think about agency, we have to think about a compassionate approach, one that is centered on permission, right? Consent. Empathy. I know it's a hot topic in certain Christian circles that empathy is not a good thing because somehow it could be considered a sin because you're not bringing truth. But I think if we start with truth, we're starting with an image of reality. And I think once we like enter in with that curiosity, with that compassion, with that willing to walk with people, there may be points to speak truth in a situation, but like that comes through conversation. And I think that that's what video games can offer, is that space for conversation and discovery of something new.
Something you just said, Ryan, I think for this group is, by and large, my thesis around games, like where do we fit in the kingdom of God, has been that given the transcendentals, the good, the beautiful, and the true, as important as they all are, truth isn't our primary weapon. And that's not to say we don't care about truth, it's not important, but that it's beauty. Amanda Simone's wheel used to say, like, there's two things that pierce the human heart, pain and beauty. And I think that idea of like beauty isn't true, it just is. And I think that's a place where we can be profoundly powerful for the kingdom of God. That said, Amy, did you want to chime in?
I think it really matters that we design games around people. When you talk about embodiment, like the very best game experiences are designed around the player, considering the player, and constantly aware that there is an embodied human participating in this story. And when we design in a way that doesn't think about that, we lose something and the games get worse. I suspect there's a through line for AI there too, that if we design AI. I know it's strange to think about designing AI, but we're choosing what to train AI on, and we're choosing what not to train AI on. And so we are designing AI. And if at any point in that journey we stop designing it with an awareness that there is an embodied human person who is beautiful somewhere in the mix that we need to be considering and caring about, then I think we will lose something there too. So I think the best games are centered entirely around the player. I think it's what this medium does that no other artistic medium does.
I wanted to say one more thing on the topic of being a space marine. I think it's a really important thing because we're dropped into these shooter games with the instruction of aim on the screen, click the button to be able to like score points, right? And if we like break it down to like the essentials of the mechanic, it's just like an aiming simulator, right? But we add narrative on top of that. And we say like, now you are going to go through a campaign and kill all the enemies, right? Then the question is, what are you doing? Are you participating in just war? Are you participating in genocide? And some first-person shooters have really brought that to bear. There's one, Spec Ops: The Line has a scene in which you're like clearing an airport and you can shoot civilians. So once you add metaphor, once you add story, the basic mechanics become very meaningful, right? And they change. I often use the question of, if you asked in a video game, if you asked somebody to like dig a hole, you would feel a certain way. If you ask somebody now to dig your own grave, they're going to have a different feeling about that, right? And so I think when we think about like mechanics as metaphor, they're very powerful and they're not innocuous. Like I just think, I'm going to spoil a sci-fi story for all of you, but like Ender's Game, in which a child soldier is playing a video game, ends in realizing he's wiping out an entire civilization. Like, just because we're doing clicks on a keyboard doesn't mean that we can't be committing atrocity. And so I think like when we think about those things, I think we have to take mechanics really seriously. And when we ask questions in video games, I think that they can have like profound effects on the way people see the world and how they see other people.
Makes me think of the point where it's pretty easy to draw out these questions of negative things, like I am practicing violence, or sex or exploitation, whatever. But I think it leads in the other direction too, is if I had a video game where the player is expected to, say, convert to Jesus, that is like the most manipulative, horrible use case of like twisted embodiment it's like, and I'm actually really against this. I'm very cautious about when games cross that line towards evangelism, because I think like you're in some pretty muddy territory. If you get to some place where someone is being led down this road by a game mechanic, and at the end you're like, do you love Jesus? Like that would be, I think, a horrible, but more to the point, I think it's like forced conversion. Anyways, I've got my own little trauma response involved there. One of the things that I think we're trying to say here, and I think especially the three of us, we're part of a conversation that is largely saying like, one of the things that art in general, but maybe games in particular, is that this actually has a really important role in things that are going on, but it's easy to miss. And for a lot of the generation who maybe didn't grow up with games, they imagine them to be toys. They imagine them to be, single player experiences in a basement. And so they're always imagining kids, and they're not imagining grown adults having really depth of experience, depth of story that can change their lives. And for the church to grapple with these questions in entertainment, questions with now like, how does AI affect this, I think is a huge part of I think the next 5 to 10 years will be a really interesting conversation. I'm really glad to be having it in this context.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today.